Imagine waking up in the dead of winter sometime around 1250, in a tiny village somewhere in medieval Europe. The air bites at your skin, your breath hangs like a cloud, and the cold is so fierce it feels like the world itself is trying to freeze you solid. You're a peasant, and your home is no fairy tale castle with roaring fireplaces and warm furs. No, it's a creaky shack with a dirt floor that's practically turned to ice, walls patched together from mud and straw, and a roof that lets in as much snow as it keeps out. Welcome to medieval winters, folks, where surviving wasn't just a challenge. It was a full-blown battle against nature's wrath. I'm your host from Boring History, and today, we're stepping into a world where every day tested your grit, your smarts, and your sheer will to keep going. So, grab something warm to sip on, pull that blanket tight, and let's dive into the frosty, unforgiving reality of life in a medieval winter. The moment you open your eyes, you're hit with a chill that makes your bones ache. Your eyebrows are crusted with frost. Yes, inside your house. Historical records from places like England and northern France tell us winter temperatures could drop to 0 degrees Fahrenheit or lower, cold enough to freeze your boots to the ground if you lingered too long. This wasn't a one-day freeze. Winters dragged on for months, with snow piling high, winds cutting like knives, and a dampness that seeped into everything. Your home, if you can call it that, was a single room, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with walls of wattle and daub, sticks and mud, basically, and a dirt floor that turned into a frozen swamp when the cold hit. Windows were just holes, maybe covered with a shutter or a scrap of cloth, letting in drafts that felt personal. Heat came from a fire pit in the center of the room, but we'll get to that later because, trust me, it was more trouble than it was worth. As a peasant, you didn't have the luxury of hitting snooze. Your day started before dawn, dragging yourself from a bed that was less cozy mattress and more pile of farm leftovers. These beds were heaps of hay or straw, sometimes 2 feet thick, layered on the floor to keep you off the icy ground. You spent all summer stockpiling this stuff, knowing it was your best defense against the cold. But these hay beds weren't exactly 5-star accommodations. They were damp, musty, and a magnet for critters, mice, bugs, even the occasional chicken that decided your bed was the perfect spot to lay an egg. One medieval scribe wrote about a peasant waking up to find a fresh egg in his bedding. Breakfast in bed, medieval style. Shaking out the hay each morning was like a treasure hunt, except the treasure was usually a mouse nest or a swarm of insects. Still, those beds were surprisingly effective. Packed tight, hay trapped air like nature's bubble wrap, keeping you warm against the frozen floor. You'd toss in old clothes, worn blankets, even dried moss to boost the insulation, because every bit of warmth mattered. Your day began with chores that couldn't wait, no matter how cold it was. Livestock needed feeding, milking, or checking to make sure they hadn't turned into cow-shaped ice sculptures overnight. You'd stumble out of bed, shake off the frost, and maybe a stray rodent, and get moving. And you weren't alone in that house. Your animals, cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, often shared the space, especially when the temperature plummeted. A cow could pump out as much heat as a small fireplace, about 5,000 BTUs per hour, and peasants knew that sleeping next to Bessie meant waking up with all your toes. But it wasn't all cozy cuddles. Imagine eating dinner while a pig tries to steal your stew or a rooster crows in your ear at midnight. It was chaos, but it was warm chaos, and in a medieval winter that was a win. Food was another hurdle. Your winter diet was whatever you'd managed to store from the harvest. Think turnips, parsnips, and something called neeps, which sounds like a medieval ailment but was just another sad root vegetable. Everything went into a pot over the fire, simmering all day into a stew that was more survival than cuisine. In desperate times, people tossed in tree bark, leather, or even a wooden spoon, claiming it added flavor. One family supposedly tried boiling their spoon for extra taste. Spoiler, it didn't work. But peasants were clever. They knew which wild herbs, like poor man's pepper, could make even the grimmest meal edible. It wasn't gourmet, but it kept you going, and that was the goal. Clothing was your armor against the cold, and wool was the star of the show. A single family might own 20 pounds of wool clothes, Imagine lugging around a toddler's worth of itchy fabric. Wool was a lifesaver because it stayed warm even when wet, thanks to lanolin, a natural oil that made it water-resistant. But it wasn't comfy. It was heavy, scratchy, and smelled like wet sheep, especially in the rain. Washing wool in winter? Forget it. Wet clothes in sub-zero temperatures could freeze solid. One peasant's coat froze so stiff it stood upright, earning the nickname John's Winter Washing and a good laugh from the village. Fleas loved wool, too, so you'd hang your clothes near the fire, hoping the smoke would drive them off. The result? You smelled like a mix of sheep and barbecue, but you were alive. Layering was an art form. You'd start with a long linen shirt, then pile on wool tunics, a jerkin, maybe a fur-lined cloak if you were lucky, all tied with a rope belt to keep it from falling off. 4 to 7 layers were normal, making you look like you'd raided every clothesline in town. Kids were bundled so tight they waddled like penguins, sometimes rolling down hills because they couldn't bend their knees. And if you needed the outhouse, good luck. Unwrapping all those layers was such a hassle that some folks skipped water altogether to avoid it. That's dedication. As you pull on those layers and brace for the day, you can't help but marvel at the sheer stubbornness it took to face a medieval winter. Every frosty morning, every smoky fire, every egg-laying chicken in your bed was a reminder that survival wasn't guaranteed. It was earned. But the house you're stepping out of? That's where the real magic happened. Because those flimsy walls and smoky fires were more than just shelter. They were fortresses against the cold. Your home was your first line of defense, and peasants got creative to make it work. Instead of building on the surface like we do now, many dug their homes 3 or 4 feet into the ground. Why? Because the earth stays a steady 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the air above is cold enough to freeze your breath. Archaeological digs show that about 40% of peasant homes in Northern Europe were partly underground, like cozy bunkers made of mud and straw. It wasn't luxurious, but it was smart, nature's insulation at its finest. Walls were slapped together with whatever was handy. Wattle and daub, stones scavenged from old Roman ruins, even a bit of animal dung for good measure. The local lords weren't thrilled about the Roman stone stealing, but when you're freezing, a stone's a stone. The roof was a masterpiece of survival engineering. Picture a lasagna of branches, straw, more branches, and maybe some turf, piled high to keep out the snow. In some villages, grass grew on the roof not for eco-points but because the roots held it all together. If your goat climbed up there for a snack, well, that was just medieval multitasking. The roof had a hole for smoke to escape, but it also let in snow, rain, and the occasional frozen bird that thought your stew pot looked like a nice landing spot. One family found a sparrow in their dinner after a storm. Not exactly the protein they were hoping for. The door was another clever touch. Most homes had just one, angled away from the wind to keep out the worst of the cold. Some even had a short entrance tunnel like an igloo to block drafts. One peasant called it entering through a dragon's throat. Probably because of the smell between the animals, the smoke, and the unwashed wool. Your house was a sensory experience. The door itself was a heavy plank or thick hide, tied shut with rope. Locks? Nope. Your security system was a loud goose that honked at anything that moved. At the center of it all was the fire pit, a 3-foot circle of stones that was both your lifeline and your biggest headache. Only about 15% of the heat stayed in the room. The rest vanished through the roof hole, along with clouds of smoke that made your eyes water and your lungs beg for mercy. Keeping it burning was a constant struggle. You'd bank the coals at night, praying they'd last till morning. If they went out, you were trekking through the snow to borrow a spark from a neighbor. One guy carried a hot coal home in a hollowed-out turnip, running so fast villagers thought he was fleeing demons. Fuel was whatever you could burn. Old furniture, broken tools, maybe a fence that disappeared overnight. One village burned an entire barn, piece by piece during a brutal winter. The Lord wasn't happy, but survival doesn't care about property lines. The smoke was a double-edged sword. It kept bugs away and preserved the roof beams. Modern tests show soot acted like a protective coating, but it also turned your home into a smokehouse, with you as the main course. Still, peasants made it work, sleeping in shifts to keep the fire going or whispering to it like it was a living thing, hoping it'd burn brighter. Superstition? Maybe. Or maybe the smoke just made them a little loopy. And then there were the animals, your live-in space heaters. Up to 30% of your house might be shared with cows, pigs, sheep, and chickens during the coldest months. A cow could churn out 5,000 BTUs of heat, enough to keep your toes from falling off. Pigs were like portable radiators, chickens warmed your feet, and sheep were walking blankets. But it was chaos. Pigs stole your stew, roosters crowed at all hours, and low barriers meant to keep them in check were more like polite suggestions. One merchant swore a rooster had it out for him, crowing in his ear every time he dozed off. Yet the animals did more than just warm the room. Their breathing added humidity, making it feel 3 to 4 degrees warmer, and their noise was a built-in alarm system. Try sneaking past a goose without waking the whole village. As you huddle by that smoky fire, surrounded by snoring pigs and a simmering pot of questionable stew, you're probably thinking about the day ahead, because staying warm indoors is only half the battle. To face the frozen world outside, you need to gear up, and that's where your clothes become your armor. You pull on your wool like it's a suit of armor because in a medieval winter it basically is. A family might have 20 pounds of wool clothing, tunics, cloaks, socks, hats, you name it. Wool was the ultimate weapon against the cold, keeping you warm even when soaked, thanks to lanolin, a natural oil that repels water. But it wasn't comfy. It was heavy, itchy, and smelled like a wet sheep pen, especially after a snowy trek. Getting that wool was no small feat every spring. You'd barter for raw fleeces, then spend hours cleaning, carding, and spinning it into something wearable. It was a family affair, with everyone pitching in to make enough clothes for winter. Washing them was out of the question. Wet wool in freezing temperatures could turn you into a human icicle. One peasant's coat froze so solid it stood on its own, earning the nickname John's Winter Washing and a permanent spot in village lore. Fleas loved wool, too, burrowing in like it was their personal paradise. You'd hang your clothes by the fire, hoping the smoke would drive them out, but that just added a smoky tang to the sheepy smell. Still, you layered up like a pro. A long linen shirt, 1 or 2 wool tunics, a jerkin, maybe a fur-lined cloak, all tied with a rope belt to keep it together. 4 to 7 layers were standard, making you look like a walking laundry pile. Kids were bundled so tight they rolled down hills like chubby penguins, unable to bend their knees. And the outhouse? A logistical nightmare. Some folks skipped water entirely to avoid the hassle of unwrapping. That's next-level survival. Socks were a treasure, woven with rabbit fur for extra warmth and worth as much as a chicken at the market. One guy swore his socks were so toasty he thought his feet might catch fire. Mittens, not gloves, were stuffed with moss, feathers, or even cat hair, because keeping your fingers together traps more heat. Hats, usually wool or felt, were pulled tight over your ears. Shoes were leather, rubbed with animal fat to keep out the snow, but wet feet were a constant struggle. Some peasants stuffed their shoes with straw or wore wooden clogs for extra protection, creating a medieval bootsock hybrid that was as practical as it was clunky. Every piece of clothing was a testament to resourcefulness, patched and mended until it fell apart. As you waddle out the door, wrapped in layers and smelling like a campfire, you're not just dressed, you're armed for battle. But surviving outside takes more than clothes. It takes tools, tricks, and a whole lot of grit. Stepping into a medieval blizzard was like walking into a war zone. Snow up to your knees, winds that could knock you flat, and cold that turned your fingers blue in minutes. Your survival kit was small but mighty, 6 to 8 tools, each one a lifeline. The snow shovel was king, carved from hardwood with a broad, flat end. Modern tests show it could move 30% more snow than today's plastic shovels, but it weighed a ton. Wielding it was like a medieval gym session, exhausting but effective. Snow poles were another gem, long sticks planted along paths to guide you through drifts. One village dyed theirs with berry juice, creating a color-coded trail system that was basically medieval GPS. Getting lost in a blizzard wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Fire starters like flint and steel were crucial. If your fire went out, you were begging for a spark from a neighbor or, in one case, carrying a coal in a turnip like your life depended on it. Snow axes chopped ice from paths or wells, and socks, thick fur-lined wool, kept your feet from freezing. Mittens, stuffed with anything from moss to cat hair, were another must-have. Science later proved keeping fingers together traps more heat, but peasants already knew that. Every tool was maintained like a family heirloom, because a broken shovel or a dull axe could mean a buried doorway or no water. Animals were your secret weapon outside the house, too. Their tracks in the snow could guide you home, and their behavior was a weather forecast. Cuddly cows meant a storm was coming. Pigs hoarding straw signaled a cold snap. It wasn't the Weather Channel, but it worked. Your animals didn't just stay in the house. They followed you outside sometimes, like sheep trailing you to the barn for feeding. Their warmth and noise were a constant reminder that you weren't alone in this fight. As you trudged through the snow, shovel in hand, bundled in wool, you can't help but marvel at the ingenuity it took to survive. Every tool, every layer, every animal roommate was a piece of a puzzle, put together with nothing but grit and smarts. These peasants didn't just endure winter. They outsmarted it, turning scraps of wood, wool, and straw into a survival machine. Looking back, it's hard not to be awed by the resilience of these medieval peasants. They faced winters that would break most of us, living in smoky, half-frozen homes with nothing but hay, wool, and a few animals to keep them alive. Every day was a test. Frosty beds, smoky fires, questionable stews, and layers so thick you could barely move. Yet they didn't just survive. They thrived, in their own stubborn, scrappy way. Their homes, half buried in the earth, were fortresses of ingenuity. Their clothes were armor, their tools weapons, their animals allies. They read the weather in the behavior of their cows and pigs, stretched their food with wild herbs, and turned every scrap into something useful. It's a story of human endurance, of refusing to let nature win, no matter how brutal the cold. As you sit in your warm house, sipping coffee and complaining about a chilly morning, think about those peasants, shivering in their underground hovels, surrounded by snoring pigs and smoky fires, wearing 20 pounds of wool just to step outside. They didn't have our tech or comforts, but they had something we can all learn from. The ability to keep going, to adapt, to make it work. That's the real magic of the medieval winter. Not just surviving, but writing a survival manual in frost and fire, one freezing day at a time. Thanks for joining me on this chilly journey through the past, folks. If you loved diving into the frozen world of medieval winters, hit that like button and subscribe to Boring History for more stories that bring the past to life. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think of these peasant survival hacks or what historical topic you want to explore next. Maybe medieval summers? Spoiler, they weren't exactly a beach vacation either. Stay warm, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.